So let me just make the point about that. And that is that when we have a problem, free people will find a way to fix it. And if you don't know how to fix it, then you get frightened and you get fearful. And it's important that you not put a person in a position of leadership who doesn't know how to do that. Now, people said that when they had the railroads, that going through the forest, the sparks would burn down the forest, and it would scare the cows, and they couldn't give milk. And besides, it went more than 35 miles an hour. You couldn't breathe, and so people would lose their lives. And so what was the point in cutting down the forest and doing all these horrible things? Well, there's always people like that. We call them Chicken Little. You know, they run around, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And they'll have a different reason as to why the sky is falling. But it's important that we keep our eyes on leaders, because leaders see a problem and fix it. And every year, life can and does get better and better and better. The number of people that used to die from dysentery and from bad water in America, there are thousands that die every day from unclean water. Now, why is that? Because they're poor. Why are they poor? Because they don't have free enterprise. They don't have capitalism. They have government redistributing the little that's there. They're taking from the productive, so the productive don't produce, so everybody's poor. In America, we honor people that produce, and therefore we create a cleaner environment. Only wealthy nations have clean environment. The poorer the country is, the more pollution there is. So when your teacher tells you about how America pollutes, America has the cleanest that there is because we're the wealthiest, and that wealth is what makes it possible. And when you take that away from people, then their lives get worse, and we can't compare it. There are those in the room over age 60 that remember a thing that was called polio. And in polio, it used to come sweeping through a neighborhood and just wipe out people all over the place. My first breakfast meeting that I had in Congress, there were probably 25 members of Congress at this little breakfast around this table. 5 of the people sitting there at that table were severely handicapped because of polio. They had to swing their leg or they had to do something. One of them is still in the Congress. His name is Ike Skelton, a wonderful man, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. But Ike has 2 arms that don't work. He has never combed his hair. He's never brushed his teeth. He's never tied a tie. He's never tied his shoes. He has his right arm. He can swing it about this high, just enough to shake hands with you, but his left arm doesn't work at all. So he's never driven a car. And why? Because of a thing called polio. In my family, one Sunday everything was fine. On Thursday, my brother died. On Saturday, my mother died. And both of polio, of something that was a plague and a scourge to the world. But in America, not fearing the future, they were able to produce a vaccine that now, when I stand here and say this to a room of this size, 9 out of 10 would say, that's just appalling. That's right. It never crosses my mind. I never worry about my kids going to a swimming pool, and yet a generation before, everybody was scared to death. So, in the process, what I want to tell you kids, that when you hear this stuff, let me give you one. Some of it is ignorance, and some of it is sophisticated fear. For example, they'll say things like there's 40% less forests in America than there was 200 years ago. Beg your pardon? Yeah, 40% less. Well, now let's just dissect that a little bit. First of all, who needs a forest? And what is the definition of a forest? And when you redefine a forest, then you can make anything say anything you want to say. So why don't we talk about trees? And you want to know something? There are 5% more trees. There are 105% of the number of trees in America as the day that Columbus discovered America. There are more trees now than there were then. And if you look at a picture of when they settled Denver, they put out there, Denver was in the middle of a dust bowl. There's nothing. And so what's the first thing somebody does? I'd like to have a little shade. And so he goes and plants a tree. And then somebody else says, well, I'd like to have a hammock, so I need 2 trees. And now, if you go to Denver and you fly over Denver, you see trees all over the place. Now, that's not a forest, by the way. None of it qualifies as a forest. But there are more trees than ever before. Now, also, what the Indians used to do is when they wanted to go hunting, they would catch it on fire and it'd wipe out a whole area, a whole forest of trees. What we do now is that we can reproduce trees. And one tree can produce, beg your pardon? And we have tree farming. That is where you go out and you cut them down on the side, and then you plant them. And when you plant them, rather than having a tree here and a tree here and a tree there and a tree there, you can actually produce 20 times as many trees, 20 times as many trees as in a forest. And so the fact of the matter is that every year those trees grow and create board lumber that is more than America can consume. And so we sell it abroad. Now that is the fact. When you're told there's 40% less forest and we're all going to die, there's the facts. There's the truth. Now, what they said was 40% less forest, from their definition, might be true. But you need to understand this, that we don't need to fear the future, that man has the capacity, because God did not create him, he created him with the capacity to preserve life. And when he reaches a problem, he can fix it. And freedom creates that. And they want to use the excuse that they want to take things away from you, and so one of the ways to do it is to convince you that you're all going to die unless you give them power to do it. Now, here's one that's just absolutely mind-blowing. Because 20 years from now, let's back up a little bit. In the 1970s, I could bring up slides here and things and show you the front page of Newsweek, cover of Newsweek, front page of New York Times and elsewhere, where it explains that we are entering an era of global cooling. And that is that we're all going to freeze to death. And they have the facts to prove it. They can show that where the polar ice cap is coming down, and that back in the 1600s, when Henry Cabot was looking for a trip, how to get to the Orient, he went up north and he came into Hudson Bay and things and named it for those folks, and that's now been closed for 100 years because the ice has come down upon it, and that there used to be, they can find the fossils of armadillo up in Montana and Minnesota, but now because the ice age is coming upon us, the armadillo are all down here in Texas or Mexico or someplace because we're getting colder and colder and colder, and then they can play all of those games. But somehow or another, they lost interest in that because people began to not believe it, I guess. And so then they came up with another one, that is, we're all going to burn up. And we're not going to have global cooling, we're going to have global warming. And if I can get you the quotes from the very same people that in 1970s and early 80s were talking about an coming ice age, they're now standing there bold-faced, unembarrassed at all, talking about how that we're now entering a global warming that we're all going to burn up. Now, one of the frustrations is that they were going to use communism. These people were all anti-free enterprise, anti-American, pro-strong government. So there are certain little levers that you can figure out. And so when you hear them talk about that, I can tell you where they stand politically. I can tell you where they stand spiritually, because they're dependent upon man. And if you tell me this, I'll tell you where they stand on global warming. And so when they're doing this, they thought communism was going to give them the power to do things in Central and Eastern Europe. But what happened was that the United States in the 1980s, the economy was growing so well and so strong, and we had a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan who didn't bow down. The first speech that Jimmy Carter gave when he became president in 1977, he went to Notre Dame. And in that speech at Notre Dame, he says that we in the West must get over our inordinate fear of communism. That is, that communism, they can do what they want to do, but freedom isn't all that good either, because look at all the problems that we have. And he was replaced by a man who said exactly the opposite. This is a man who had been a Union president, had fought the communists in the 1940s and 50s, developed a hatred for communism because he saw what it did to people and things. And when he became president, he said, that's an evil empire because they take over countries and treat people like scum. And the fact is that remember I talked about inventions? They can't make anything. 2/3 of the world is covered by communism. They can't invent or create anything. They can't make a hairdryer that people will voluntarily purchase. They can't make an automobile people would choose to have. All they can do is steal from the free people. And he said, in fact, they couldn't even survive unless they could find free people that loan them money to do it. And so what happened was that the head of the CIA and his campaign manager, Bill Casey, went into him one day and he said, do you see this? Do you see that every year they're borrowing money from the West? Otherwise, they couldn't survive. If we didn't give them food, and what would happen is we would loan them money to purchase food because they had 73 years of bad weather. And you all know this, but there's young people in the room. Let me just tell you this. That remember the first party purchase where you purchase something for yourself. In Russia, people were literally starving. Now this is in just the Ukraine, in just the country of Ukraine, which is just a section of Russia that was overrun by Catherine the Great, that was called the breadbasket of Europe. They had the capacity to produce food everywhere. When communism comes in and you don't own it, therefore you don't care. And so what happens, people were starving and they couldn't even stay alive, and so they made an exception and they said, here's what you can do. He said, we will give you quarter-acre plots. Now, how many know what a quarter of an acre is? Would this room be a quarter of an acre? What's that? About a quarter of an acre, be about the size, a little bit, slightly more than this room. They said that people, if you produced food on they gave you little plots of land of a quarter of an acre, and you could produce food on that, and if you produced it there, you could keep that so that they could stay alive. So they would work all day on these vast farms, as you saw in your books about how marvelous it was, where they had all these harvesters, and as far as you can see the government plan, and they'd have all of them smiling and carrying on, holding their pitchforks and doing all these things. They'd do that all day long, and then they would go home and they'd work in this little garden. And by 1980, the production of the little quarter-acre plots was greater than all of those vast fields with all of their tools and all their natural harvesters and all this sort of thing, because when a person produces it for themselves, they produce wealth, but government doesn't produce enough. And so, in the process of doing that, Ronald Reagan came along and he said, how about if we, instead of giving them credit to buy food, why don't we quit giving them credits?